That's it. Thank you very much. We are now proceeding to the question and answer and discussion. I was prepared with some myself, but I see we have people already standing, so I think we should take advantage of a highly knowledgeable audience. I think over here, all you've got to do, you don't have to really wear it. You just click it on. You can put it on or you can hold it however you like. Why don't we start right over here? Please identify yourself first and then pose the question.
Edmund Rolls, Oxford. My question is to Dr. Avena about intermittency. So it's very clear from your data that the intermittent access to food is an important bit in the rat model. Now, can you comment on exactly what's happening here? Is the animal getting highly stressed? Is it a stress-induced relief that then the food gives? How relevant is this to humans, where we wouldn't have the same forced removal of food and then reaccess? So what happens with, for example, anti-anxiety drugs? Does that abolish this particular phenomenon, the diet-induced obesity?
Yeah, great questions about intermittency. So the reason why we use an intermittent schedule in order to get the animals to overconsume the foods is because we find that if you give the animals ad libitum access to the food, they're pretty good at regulating their intake. And while they will become overweight, they don't necessarily show these signs of addictive-like behaviors. And the intermittent access is really, it's sort of a limited extended access, if you will. So in my studies and in some of Paul Kenny's studies where we give limited access, we're talking about giving access between 12 and 18 hours a day. So it's a large part of the day, but it's not ad libitum access where they could get up in the middle of the night and eat. Now, the reason I think limited access is important is because it does cause the animals to engage in a binge behavior when they begin to eat. And I think that may be critical. And I think although we tend to think about our sort of human counterparts as walking around in an ad libitum fed food environment where we have constant access to food, we don't have limited access to food, but in many ways the eating patterns in which we engage in are self-limiting. We, tend to eat in meals, or many people who are trying to lose weight will restrict their intake and then they end up over-consuming and having a binge. And so the reason for using the limited access model is really sort of to instigate a large meal and to cause the animals to eat in a way that is similar to what the type of eating patterns we tend to see in humans who have problems losing weight and problems regulating their food intake.
What about the anti-anxiety drugs?
Great question. We have not administered anti-anxiety drugs using this model, so it would be a good empirical question to look at. We have used naloxone, and we've used some other types of pharmacological compounds. We actually just published a paper using baclofen and the combination of baclofen and naltrexone, and we find that that can mitigate the overeating effects. Whether or not it mitigates these aspects of addiction, we have yet to study, but great questions and things we should really look at.
Next question.
A little shorter. I'm Kate Olinger. I'm a fellow with IFIC this summer and a graduate student at Tufts University. I was wondering if there's any research being done to look at other aspects of food that might contribute to the addictive behaviors other than the components of the foods themselves. For example, the sensory and visual appeal of foods and the ease of a handful of potato chips or M&Ms, and perhaps if we were to dye a hamburger green and the bun green, if that might help dissuade some people from expressing that addictive behavior. And I'm wondering how we can separate some of the other factors of food from the food components themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Lots of great research ideas there. A lot of, I think, what's happening, at least on the human side of this, has to do with the conditioning that's associated with the cues that are associated with the food. We even see this in our rat models as well. After just a few days of access to these highly palatable foods, the rats become conditioned to when they're going to get them. They learn to expect them. They become conditioned to us walking in the room to give them, their cheese doodles or their M&Ms. And so all of these environmental cues serve to, in many ways, reinforce some of these behaviors or encourage some of these behaviors. And I think that that's a very important thing that we need to think about when we think about how foods are packaged, how they're marketed. Simply seeing, the package associated with these foods that people have experience with overeating can affect brain reward systems in a way that might be priming them to then want to eat that food. And so playing around with these different variables about the textures of foods, the sights, the smells, I think those are all very important things that we should start to look at as ways to possibly help reduce overconsumption of some of these types of foods.
Peter, do you want to comment?
Yes, I think I can add some thoughts to that. To some extent, it is about the food itself. The food. However attractively we packaged cabbage, for example, I don't think it would become a binge food for what are probably obvious reasons. The characteristics of foods that are important here, I think, are its energy density, as I said in my talk. But also taste characteristics will be important as well. So we know we have an innate liking for sweet tastes. We like salty tastes. And many of the foods that we find attractive have those taste characteristics. So there are certain things about taste characteristics, but also about the nutrient contents of the foods themselves that are very important. The packaging merely represents to us, reminds us what those what the value of that food is in terms of its taste and energy value. So we know these conditions, stimuli, they can be arbitrary stimuli themselves. They're paired with certain effects of eating, and they gain value. Those stimuli gain value on that basis.
Let's move to.
I think Nicole and I agree on that.
Let's move to this side of the room.
Hi, Joe Herskovic, Workshop Planning Committee. Dr. Avena, is there any evidence that the sugar addiction model that you talked about in rats is applicable to artificial sweeteners?
Great question. So we've studied this to some extent. It's a little difficult to study artificial sweeteners in rat models because rats don't taste artificial sweeteners in the ways that humans do. So for instance, rats don't detect the taste of aspartame. So it's tough to study it in many ways, but we have done some work looking at sham feeding. And so sham feeding is a situation in which you can have an animal taste a food, ingest it, but they have either an esophageal or a gastric cannula so that they taste the food, but they don't necessarily digest it. Basically, it can exit through the throat or through their stomach before they fully digest it. So this allows us to look at whether or not it's the taste or it's some post-ingestive effects that seem to be causing these changes. And what we've found is that the sweet taste seems to be sufficient to produce the reinforcement or the reinstatement of the dopamine release. So even when animals are simply sham feeding sugar and not digesting it, it will cause this repeated release of dopamine. Interestingly, other researchers have shown that if you sort of do the opposite to what we've done and you don't let the rats taste the sugar, but you just infuse it into the gut, that can also release dopamine in brain reward regions. So I think when one ingests sugar that's caloric, it has sort of a double whammy effect in that it's releasing dopamine via the taste and also post-ingestive effects. But when we consume artificial sweeteners, we are getting some stimulation of the dopamine system from them as well, just via the sweet taste.
So one follow-up to that, would you be able to do, or colleagues be able to do that type of research in, say, primates who might taste artificial sweeteners?
Sure, that would be a very good experiment to do.
I mean, in some ways, we already have that research in human primates, and in the sense there have been many studies in which artificial usually beverages, but foods as well, sweetened with intense sweeteners. Artificial sweeteners have been compared with sugar-sweetened foods. Beverages containing artificial sweeteners compared with water in terms of their effects on appetite and body weight over a period of time. And in fact, we've just come to the end of a long review of this literature. There's a very nice study that's also just been published that we missed in our review. But all the evidence from human studies converges on the notion that intense sweeteners, I don't like calling them artificial sweeteners for a variety of reasons. Some of them aren't artificial, arguably. Intense sweeteners actually help us eat less if we replace sugar-sweetened beverages, for example, with intensely sweetened beverages. We eat less, and there's a loss of body weight. More compelling is that intense sweeteners look about the same as water. So if people are advised to consume water in place of sugar-sweetened beverages, they do about the same, if not worse, actually, this most recent study, if not worse than if they're advised to eat drink intensely sweetened beverages. So I would sum up the human studies as saying these substances are probably useful, which is something I wouldn't have said 30 years ago when I first did some work on this, but I'm thoroughly convinced by this evidence.
Thank you. Let's move back over here.
Hi, thank you so much for the lectures. My name is Skylar Young. I'm from the Senate Agriculture and Nutrition Committee. And my question is, I'm wondering about food aversions, and that is, in a lot of lower socioeconomic communities, they just have corner stores, not really supermarkets with abundant fresh foods, and they kind of develop this, I don't know, a quick attachment to these highly palatable foods like Pop-Tarts, and develop, I think, food aversions to healthy foods, right, because they don't have that access. I'm wondering if there's a solution to this and how we can bring this education to these kind of communities that are suffering from kind of what you were talking about in your lecture, Nicole.
Yeah, so I'm at Columbia, which is in Harlem, and we see a lot of this in our neighborhood. And I think there's a lot of different organizations that I'm aware of that are in the New York City area that are trying to do many things like you're suggesting, which is to go into schools and educate children about eating a variety of types of foods, the importance of seeking out healthy food, seeking out fruits and vegetables, and how long-term they can be very important to one's diet, and how not having easy access to them can be detrimental to one's health. And so I certainly think it's a need. It's one that I see every day at work, and I think it's something that, you know, hopefully as a society we can do more about in terms of educating people. I think it starts with educating the children, to be honest, because, you know, they are the ones that are going to ultimately make the decisions about what they eat. And I can say this as a parent too, because I have a 5-year-old, and I know that at a very, very young age, you lose control over what your kids are going to eat. And so I think educating children is really, you know, sort of cornerstone to getting some change in place in terms of, you know, expanding their diets.
I would certainly agree with that, but would also add, to some extent, it's about convenience and access. So that many so-called healthy foods take more skill, more equipment to prepare than meals which or foods which are more convenient and higher energy density and attractive in some other ways. So actually, I would argue perhaps the solution is to make healthy foods more convenient, more accessible. I think an example of this that I heard recently, and I hope this is the case, but I understand that McDonald's in the US and indeed in the UK have, for children's meals, have replaced fries with apple slices. And that this is, I hope this is true, and that this has proved very, very successful. And that's become the default offer with that particular meal, and has been widely accepted, and it's increased the demand for apples in the US in a major way. So initiatives like that could be potentially very successful in nudging eating behavior in a healthier direction. So it is about availability, convenience, as well as definitely about education about healthy eating.
Next, Dr. Clydesdale.
For Clydesdale, University of Massachusetts Amherst, and thank you both for fascinating presentations. And it isn't my question, but I would just like to point out to the audience that there are some healthy foods available in frozen and canned foods. So they've been around for a couple of years, and anybody who wants them can go to most of their supermarkets and get them. The question I had is a little bit on intermittency, but I wondered how much does sensory-specific satiety have with the lack of or the amount of evidence you're seeing?
So there's been several different models that have been used to sort of look at this question. And one of the ones that we developed in my lab was this model looking at sugar. And so interestingly, we see less evidence of sensory-specific satiety when these animals are binging or over-consuming sugar, in that they seem to be consuming larger and larger amounts of it over the course of a month. The binges each day seem to grow and get larger. Now, when we've expanded this, and other labs have used other models to look at foods that contain a variety of tastings, using the cafeteria diet model, for example. I think that's where we see sensory-specific satiety coming into play, where it's very easy for the rat to shift to another type of food to stimulate some other sense. And in many ways, I think that's more like what we see happening in our modern food environment. We don't have a sensory-specific satiety to one type of food because we're not eating one type of food. We have such a variety of food in our food environment that we can really, change gears at any given moment.
Yeah, I'm trying to get my head around the fact, is it due to the fact that we just have a lot of foods available, or is it due to the fact that we indeed are addicted to a substance?
Well, I think it's a combination.
And that was discussed somewhat yesterday.
Right, and I think that, sort of a variety of substances, the variety of different foods is, again, I think one of these contributing factors that might relate to some of the things that we were talking about today. I think they're related, but I think we can also study them in a mutually exclusive manner. I think one can be addicted to cocaine, but not necessarily be addicted to other drugs. And we need to do some more research, I think, to understand exactly, where does the nature of food fall under that umbrella, and how can we think about food in that way?
Yeah, I don't want to be, but I mean, the guy outside with the brown bag is not worried about sensory-specific satiety. I mean, what he's drinking in the brown bag, as long as it's got alcohol in it, he doesn't really care.
Right, and I've never heard of an obese person that walks through the hallway at my work tell me that they're worried about sensory-specific satiety.
And I
either.
guess that's what I'm trying to get at. Is that a problem with the obese? Is sensory-specific satiety a problem with obesity?
We'd have to ask someone who is an expert of, speaking with people who are, patients, but I can say from my impression, I think that it seems to be less of a problem, because we see that, again, when people are obese or who are overeating, they are eating in excess. And so the sensory-specific satiety mechanism that should be coming into play is not. And whether it's maybe they're becoming satiated to one particular food and then switching to another, or if that satiety is just simply dampened because they're overweight or obese, is a question that I think we don't know the answer to.
Thank you.
Peter?
I just add very briefly, absolutely, I think food variety will contribute to overconsumption. But overconsumption is possible on a very narrow range of food variety. A single energy-dense food can promote overconsumption, certainly in animals. And the other point to make is that we often talk about the enormous variety of foods available to us. And my colleague Jeff Brunstrom in Bristol makes a very good case about this, showing supermarkets packed with a whole variety of foods. The question I always have to Jeff and perhaps to others now is actually, what do individuals eat? I suspect as individuals we eat a rather more narrow range of food. So actually quite a small range as individuals will be sufficient to promote overeating if consumed in excess of energy needs. So yes, variety plays a role. I'm not clear to what extent it plays a role.
Final thought on that regarding sensory-specific satiety. I think it's also important to dissociate between hunger and hedonic eating. And if you remember, I had a slide up where I sort of described these two different concepts. One is we're talking about a negative reinforcement, and one we're talking about positive reinforcement. So I wonder if maybe sensory-specific satiety plays less of a role in the discussion when we're talking about hedonically driven eating. And the type of eating that we're talking about when we, I think, are characterizing work related to food addiction has more to do with hedonically driven eating as opposed to hunger-driven eating.
Thank you. Next speaker, next questioner.
Hi, Hisham Ziauddin, University of Cambridge. I have a couple of questions for Nicole. The first was to follow up an earlier question about intermittency. And I noticed in the data you showed that where animals are consuming alcohol in the sort of cross-sensitization type model, that you have the greatest alcohol consumption in the ad-libitum sugar-consuming rats, but you also had an elevated consumption in the rats that had intermittent access to chow. And I wonder whether there's a greater role there of intermittency in promoting some of these behaviors.
Right, so you actually misspoke. We saw the greatest increase in alcohol consumption in the rats that are intermittently consuming sugar.
That's
not
true,
rats
but there's
that
the next
have-
bar after that, perhaps I was mistaken,
Right.
was intermittent chow.
Right.
It's definitely highest in the sugar consuming, but there's also an elevation in the intermittent chow consuming rats?
Yeah, so in our studies, we try to be as careful as possible with isolating these variables for the reasons that you suggest. And so we always have rats that have intermittent access to the healthy food, the rat chow, and then the palatable food. And then we also try to control for access to whether it's, the healthy food or the palatable food. And so intermittency, I do think, is important. And in that particular study, we did see that in the rats that had just simple intermittent access to the rat chow, they did show a slightly elevated increase in alcohol intake, but it wasn't to the extent that we saw with the rats that have access to sugar and chow. We've done some other studies looking at other drugs of abuse in which those types of conditions were also run, and we didn't see the effect with the limited access to the chow. And so in that particular study, we did see a finding that, suggested that it was related. I think it underscores the whole idea that overconsumption or consuming something in a bolus can have an effect on these brain reward systems, and that certainly contributes to, I think, what we're seeing with the overconsumption of the highly palatable foods.
The reason I asked that is perhaps I've misunderstood, because I'm not very familiar with the animal literature in that sense, but certainly with the intermittent models, you get a lot of elevated consumption in the first hour or the first period of access. But if you average out consumption over the 24 hours between the different groups, some studies have shown that actually the overall consumption is not very different, but it's actually the intensity of consumption, the first or the earlier intervals, that's more marked in the intermittent access groups.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's a fair comment.
I didn't have time to include this slide, but when I often give this lecture, I'll show a slide of data we have where we've monitored rats' food intake over a 24-hour period. And so we can actually see how many binges they're consuming or what manner in which they're eating. And we see that while they do tend to have the largest meal at the onset of access to the palatable food, they actually over time engage in binge-eating behavior throughout the day. And so we will see that over time, when they're repeatedly consuming these types of foods, they will have fewer but larger meals compared with animals who have ad libitum access to them. And so what we see in our data is that if you sum it up over time, that they are actually hyperphagic and they are consuming more total calories over the course of a 24-hour period.
Okay. May I have one more question? But I'm happy to step aside if there are other people who need to go.
Yeah, I think we should probably let others speak, and then you can, get in again later. Thank you very much. And just as we're pausing between speakers, we have about 5 minutes left. I see we have some more people lining up. If there's anybody from webcast that wants to ask a question, I see I have one lined up. We'll be getting to those in just a minute.
Good morning. Thank you for a very, very interesting talk. I'm Wendy Johnson-Askew. I'm with Nestle Nutrition. And I have a couple of questions because I'm not quite convinced, because I'm trying to understand how this all works with communities of color and communities of disparity in income and resources, resource poor, because we have greater levels of obesity in those areas. So just following the premise of addictive behavior, are you positioning that there's potentially larger levels of addiction in those areas? This question follows in those particular communities. This question follows the young woman who asked a very good question about how can we use this information to change environments or educate people so that they can eat better. And most of these communities are so stressed. They have very complicated lives. And I think we do them a disservice when we are so simply say that we can educate them out of this. This is a much larger problem. And I am very concerned if the thinking is that these resource-poor communities have higher levels of addiction, therefore they are obese. So I would just like to get your opinion of that.
I can comment on that. I agree with you. I think this is really, something that I struggle with too, in trying to figure out ways in which we might try to better get a handle on this. In terms of the data of whether or not underserved communities are going to have higher incidence of food addiction, I think that's an empirical question that we have not yet answered. And so, hopefully we will be able to continue to get funding for this type of work so that we can very much answer those types of questions, so that we know where we might start to target our resources and target educational efforts. I agree with you that it does seem a little bit overly ambitious and overly hopeful to think that we may be able to simply educate our youth out of this. But I do have some hope in that if we can try to incorporate education in a way that can be fun and interesting for children, that we might be able to have some of them catch on. And so one of the things that I've done is partnered with Ed. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with the TED organization, who does little talks about different scientific topics. And I got together with Ted and we put together a short 5-minute video that's animated, a cartoon, that talks about what different foods can do to your brain. And it's geared toward children so that they can better understand when they eat these types of foods, what are some of the effects that it might have on their brain and what are some of the long-term consequences. So I think trying to target our education toward the children in a way that's going to be engaging for them and something that they're going to follow along with is really one way in which we can begin to think about educational efforts. But I agree with you, we need to think beyond that and think outside the box in terms of how we might diversify some of our approaches.
Or anything to add?
Well, just briefly that it is certainly the case that obesity shows the same patterning of socioeconomic patterning as other unhealthy behavior, including drug use, alcoholism, for example. I don't think that in itself those observations help us at all in terms of interventions. We heard yesterday perhaps the role of stress in certain communities may underlie unhealthy behavior. There are other elements as well in terms of attitudes. Certainly, research in the UK would suggest, in some communities that obesity, diabetes is almost normative among some individuals. So the idea that I've just been diagnosed with diabetes, well, actually a lot of my friends have it, and it's an inevitable part of my getting older, and that actually probably undermines the idea that I should do anything to try and change this behavior. So I think it's probably tackling some of those ideas and attitudes that could be helpful as well.
Thank you. We are coming close to the end of our session. We have 2 people standing, so we'll take both of those questions, but we'll have to call it after that. So please, the next question is from someone in a webcast. We're delighted that IOM has been able to webcast this session, and we thank somebody for calling in with a question.
Thank you.
So please.
This question is from David Clarfield, and it's specifically directed to Dr. Avina. Since listening to music reproducibly elicits the same dopamine response in the striatal system as does consumption of hedonically pleasing foods, are you willing to make the argument that listening to jazz is addictive? Does this indicate in our inability to distinguish between pleasure and addiction with current biological methods?
So that's an interesting question. I don't think that we will be considering jazz music addictive at any time soon unless people are engaging in other DSM criteria associated with that. I think it's important to come back to the point that, there is not one single feature that defines something as being addictive. And so I presented data from behavioral, neurochemical studies that have been done, and, Peter's been talking about a lot of different aspects of what goes into something being addictive. And certainly, as I mentioned in my talk, foods are known to activate brain reward systems, so are sexual behaviors, so are other pleasurable activities. But it's the manner in which those systems are engaged, the extent to which those systems are engaged, and the long-term effects of engagement engagement of those systems. And so studies with food have recently shown, much like what we see with drugs of abuse, alterations in the gene expression for these neurotransmitters that we've been talking about today, changes in dopamine transporter. Again, it's not just one feature of activating the brain reward system, but a conglomeration of long-term effects of activating that system that seems to be more in line with what we see with a drug addiction and less in line with what we see with just simple pleasurable engagement in many of the activities that we all do throughout our day. So I appreciate the comment and the question, and I think it's a valid one to make, but I think it does underscore that when we talk about addiction, we're talking about a multifaceted, multi-featured issue that we need to study from multiple angles.
Again, I think the only thing I would add to that is I think it's useful to think in terms of activities, substances, as the addiction risk that they pose. So I wouldn't say it's out of the realms of possibility that jazz could be addictive or someone could be addicted to jazz. They could show the features of spending all their time listening to jazz, not being able to change that behavior and so on, and that behavior really interfering with their economic and social life. There is actually a case of carrot addiction written up in the New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry that I think makes interesting reading in that it's a very individual case. Carrots pose clearly a low risk of addiction, but it is possible to show addictive behavior in relation to eating carrots, to the extent that this individual turned yellow because she ate vast amounts of carrots for very specific reasons. So I like to think in terms of risk posed of addiction by substances and activities.
Last question.
Thank you. Daniel Greenberg, PepsiCo. I'd like to get back to your limited availability of food. I don't know if you're familiar with schedule-induced polydipsia, where rats will in the absence of thirst, rats will drink vast quantities of water based solely on an intermittent reinforcement schedule. So I wonder if your interpretation of it being hedonically important to do with your sugar solutions is really valid, given that I could get the exact same results with water.
Good question. So we have control groups. Well, first of all of our rats are offered water in addition to the sugar solution. So they are in no way forced to consume the sugar solution.
But what if they were offered only the water?
If they were offered only water? Well, that's the case that we see in our rats that are in our binge access group. Oh, you mean so if they had limited access just to water? Right. So in our studies with our sugar solution, the rats have free access to water, and they have limited access.
That's not the control.
Her question is only water. What if you took out the sugar?
The important control here is whether or not, just by your reinforcement schedule, similar to what's seen in a large body of literature on schedule-induced polydipsia, whether just your reinforcement schedule would get them to overconsume water.
Well, I think you've just said that that's the case. That is what the definition of schedule-induced polydipsia is, that you can get them to overconsume water.
Yeah, but the question is whether your experimental paradigm would elicit that.
Well, I think the question would really be whether or not rats that have schedule-induced polydipsia also show some of the other measures that I've shown in terms of changes in the brain.
Do. So I would suggest that you need a control condition where you have your limited access and the only thing available is not sugar water, but just water.
We'll take that as a research suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you.
That brings this session to an end. I want to thank both of our speakers. This whole discussion really reminds me of a discussion we had at the FDA when I was there, dealing with emerging science and health claims. And everybody wanted to know, if you have preliminary evidence, how do you know that preliminary evidence is going to hold over the long run? And IOM actually did a study on that. And the answer to the study was, you don't know. Sometimes they do and sometimes you don't. There were no predictive values, but nevertheless, we have to pursue it. And again, I want to thank the IOM for organizing this session. It's clear there's a lot of interest in the issue. I want to thank both of our speakers for doing an excellent job in fielding some tough questions. And again, thank the audience for your participation. And please, a final round of applause for our speakers.